This is going to be an introduction to Michel Foucault's work. Foucault was born in 1926 and died in 1984. Some technical difficulties here, bear with me. So he was born to an upper middle class family. His father was actually a doctor, and he was educated as a Catholic. He went to Catholic school and he attended church, and for a while he even served as an altar boy. You will see that this is kind of funny by the end of the lecture. His father was extremely authoritarian. So there are many, many critics that look at Foucault's early life and derive understandings of why he focused on power, sexuality, religion, mental health, because all of this was so connected with his own personal life. So when he was young, he entered the École Normale Supérieure, and that's one of the most important institutions in France, and there he was mentored by Louis Althusser, who was a Marxist that changed Marxism quite deeply and came up with a very important concept of overdetermination. You know how Marx thinks that it's the economy that determines everything else, including culture, religion, the way we connect with each other, etc. For Althusser, the economy was at the base of everything also, but he also acknowledged that there were many other axes of oppression and resistance that also determine the way that we think and live. So Foucault is mentored by Althusser. This has a huge impact in the way that he starts understanding Marxism. But in the meantime, his personal life becomes very complicated, and he starts self-mutilating and attempts suicide more than once. So at this point, his father persuades him to see a psychiatrist, and Foucault finds out that his psychiatrist thinks that the issue here is that Foucault is gay and that he is forced to live in the closet because being gay was such a taboo in France still in those days. So later on, he joins the Communist Party, but he leaves kind of quickly after 3 years because he's horrified by the Communist Party anti-Semitism and homophobia. As you know, the Communist Party was extremely homophobic. This was suffered by people who were gay, both in the Soviet Union and in Cuba. Cuba later on cleaned up their act, but in any case, when Foucault is a member of the party, he's disgusted by these attitudes and he leaves after 3 years. Then he goes to work in Poland, to teach in Poland, and there he has even more of a fallout with the Soviets when he sees what Polish society is like, the lack of freedoms, etc. So for a while he flirts with Maoism. He's interested in this different way of thinking about communism and how to take over power and who is the leader of the party. In the case of the Maoists, it were the peasants, the leaders, but he never finally joins the party. He actually is close to Maoists because his longtime partner, Daniel Deferred, is a member of the Maoist party. So Foucault is hated by Marxists for his attacks on some of the basic tenets of dialectic materialism. He doesn't think that the economy determines everything that there is. He thinks that there are many other axes of sexuality, like sexuality, gender, and others that also determine the way that we live as much as the economy. In this, he breaks with Marxism that thinks that the main determinant is the economy. So that's one of his biggest problems with Marxism. Then he's also very much against what we could call Stalinist Marxism, this totally bureaucratic Marxism that stems from the Soviet Union and that pretty much smothered any kind of intellectual development that the French people could have had at the universities because they were so controlled by this Stalinist Marxism. And this is the kind of Marxism that Foucault attacks in his work. So Marxists hated him because of this very much. And still to this day, if you check out the web pages or the Facebook profiles of traditional Marxists, you will see that they attack Foucault or they attack Federici as somebody who also builds on Foucaultian theory, not just traditional Marxist theory. So Foucault had lots of influences from different fields of thought. One of the main influences is Nietzsche. From Nietzsche, he gets his idea of power, and the connection between power and knowledge comes from Nietzsche. Very important. Another huge influence that also separates him from Marxism is Max Weber, the sociologist, one of the first sociologists, who thought that the realm of the superstructure, remember this distinction that Marx made between the base, the structure, the economy basically, and the superstructure, how we represent what we do, whether it's by film or TV or newspapers or language, our own discourse, our ideas. Weber thought that this realm was separated from the economy. He's also influenced and a critic of Freud, of Lacan. He was a structuralist in his youth, Levi-Strauss, but he overcomes this way of thinking that derives from anthropology. And he's also very much influenced by Antonin Artaud, who was a theater maker, and as I explained earlier, Louis Althusser. So Foucault thinks that there are no truths. This comes from his influence with Nietzsche. He thinks that truth actually is socially constructed. You might have heard this many times in the past, this idea of social construction of reality, of what we call reality, of the concepts that we use to understand reality. He thinks that these are derived from the power structures that determine whose story we are going to tell. So if we want to put this in Marxist terms, for example, surplus value is a truth contested by the bourgeois because it doesn't help them with their own narrative of the world. Since if you adhere to the concept of surplus value, you are telling the bourgeois that they are making money out of the work of somebody else. So this is a case of a socially constructed truth, whether we think that there is surplus value or there is no extraction of surplus value. We as a society are struggling over this truth. And this truth is extremely connected with power. So Foucault thinks that it's not just the economy that can be explained through analysis of power, but pretty much everything that we do in society can be explained through our understanding of power and how we socially construct different concepts and even different realities in a way. So something that he uses to prove this theory is to showing us who was considered crazy and why in the 1800s. So if you read this list that I put up here, you will see that it's extremely gendered. And also that some of the stuff that they thought would drive you crazy and that you would be sent to an asylum for in those days are not considered that way at all. So if truth, the truth of being crazy, the truth of not being normal, were something that is written somewhere and had something that connected with reality in a way that went beyond our own agreement of what is a mental health issue, then people would still be going to the asylum for either masturbation, lack of masturbation, suppression of masturbation, too long of a time masturbating. Those are all causes for being sent to the asylum in the 1800s that nowadays we kind of laugh at it. So in those days, you couldn't get it right. If you did it, there was something wrong with you. If you stopped doing it, there was something wrong with you, etc., etc. So, as I said, extremely gendered, and a lot of it connected with the control of who's normal, what's a norm, who's a norm, how do we determine who's a norm. So in those days, having a female disease, whatever that meant, could mean that you ended up in an asylum. Political excitement, politics, religious enthusiasm, fever and loss of a lawsuit, fits and desertion of husband, asthma, bad company. So, bad company, you know, how many of us would be in the asylum now over bad company? So we bring this up again just to show that the truth of who's normal is something that was at some point and continues to be every day discuss amongst us the norms, right? We who think of ourselves as norms, we can discuss the truth about being crazy, being mad, being sent to an asylum. So Foucault quite consequentially created an anti-psychiatry movement, an anti-prison movement, and he was also a radical educator. So all of this happens in 1968 or around that time when the students revolt against the government in France and also against the Communist Party and its influence over education in Europe and particularly in France. So Foucault, who studies power in these days, becomes critical of Marxism, although I understand that he's still a Marxist, although not a Marxist that thinks that everything's determined by the economy, but still a Marxist in the way that he understands power and in the way that he understands that all of these discussions over the truth of who's normal, who's mad, who's legit, who needs to go to jail and why, who's sick, who's healthy, whether changing sexes at some point in your life is, as the Psychiatry Association thought until recently, a disorder, or if it's a choice, because sexuality is also socially constructed. We have sex in certain ways and we're attracted to certain people according to the social construction of sex that we've engaged in. Same thing with going to prison. Who goes to prison and why? Is it necessary to have a prison? Who does prison serve and why do we have prison? In the text that I assigned, Foucault claims that prison is relatively new, that before the French Revolution, what we had were places where we held people that had committed crimes before we killed them or we tortured them or we forced them to walk over embers to find out if they were innocent or not. All of this is relatively new, and Foucault thinks that all of these techniques of the self, as he calls it, all this discourse that is created around health, sexuality, gender, the economy, social classes, race, racism, all of this is something that is engaged by those who have the most power and the most control in society, governments, sciences, medicine, psychiatry. Think of the role of those sciences in determining our truth, whether we are norms or we are not norms, and we need to be sent to an asylum. So Foucault looks at all these ways in which society normalizes or tries to normalize individuals, and he concludes that this is a way that power operates everywhere, but particularly he's studying how it operates in Europe under capitalism. So this is just a cool picture that I wanted to show you of Foucault in the 60s when they were engaging in protests because they had created this cool institute for studies, a university with no degrees, no grades, no attendance policy. You would have loved that school, but the Minister of Culture hated it and closed it pretty quickly. So, the late years of Foucault and his death. Foucault was notoriously into SM, sadomasochism. He thought that this was it, that this was sexual pleasure that hadn't been hijacked by discourse into something else, but rather this was a new pleasure that hadn't existed before, and he was completely open about engaging in this kind of sexuality, and he was often seen in clubs in San Francisco. As I mentioned earlier, he was also in a non-monogamous relationship with Danielle Defert. At this point, Defert was in France, and Foucault came during the last years of his life to San Francisco to teach at UC Berkeley. And there, apparently, he was already sick with AIDS. But at that point, AIDS was not universally accepted as a legit sickness. Many of us thought that it was something that the priest or somebody had invented because, it was almost perfect. How do you get this sickness? By having sex, by doing drugs, basically by doing things that the Catholic Church thought you shouldn't do. So many of us thought that it was something else and that it was wrongly attributed to these activities that we were finally being able to, excuse me, to enjoy freely after the discovery of different ways of taking care of our reproductive and antibiotics. We thought, well, now is the time for fun, and here comes this new theory that people are dying because they're having too much fun. So Foucault dies before AIDS becomes known and well-studied sickness, and he's been accused of spreading AIDS in San Francisco because in the clubs, as you know, there was no use of condoms that would have prevented the spread of the disease. But as I said, I think this is an unfair critique because most of us at that point were not aware exactly what AIDS was. So in any case, Foucault died without anybody acknowledging that he was dying of AIDS, but 2 years later, Defert does create the first national HIV/AIDS organization in France, and he acknowledges that Foucault dies of AIDS. So what are Foucault's main concepts? The ones that he's most known for? Probably the concept that you've heard the most is biopower. We were briefly introduced to the notion of biopower when we read Silvia Federici's text, Caliban and the Witch. In Caliban, Federici fixes both Marx and Foucault. She fixes Marx because she says, well, come on, Marx, how come you didn't see that women were doing all the reproductive work, and without reproductive work, the guys wouldn't have been able to be exploited at the factory. So this is her fixing of Marx. But she also fixes Foucault. because Foucault thinks that we are encultured under capitalism, mostly through our sexuality, not so much through the economy, but through our sexuality. And Federici says, well, yeah, you think that, and I agree with that, but our sexuality has been controlled by power, not so much through the confession, as Foucault claims in the history of sexuality, but mostly through the witches' hunt, is what Federici says. The witches allowed us to have fun sex and not reproduce because they knew of herbs that we could take to avoid to control our fertility, and if all else failed, they knew how to get an abortion. So Foucault doesn't go that way, and Federici critiques him for that. But Foucault does come out with the concept of biopower that both Federici and many, many other people use, which is the idea that power changed at the end of medieval ages. And in the text that you read, Foucault talks about how punishment was mostly destroying the body. As you must have noticed, he starts with this very detailed description, graphic, I should say, description of this guy who had attempted against the life of his father. And at that time, the father and the king were the same judicial figure. So if you attempted against your father, it was the same as attempting against the king. And you read it. He was killed, was the last thing he endured, because before that, they did all kinds of horrendous things to him. They even took his intestines out and burned them while he was still alive. So Foucault says, well, that's the past. That's the power of the kings, the power over life or death. But under capitalism, we displace the punishment, and instead of being over the body, it is over time. If you mess up bad enough that I have to send you to jail, I will make sure that you get a sentence that is very much about you, about who you were, when you were a child, what kind of life you had. And the jury will make an effort to adjust the sentence to your own way of being. So he thinks this is a way of power to know you, to put like a brand on you, which will be innocent or guilty, and if guilty, guilty of what, and what's the best way to get you to stop doing that. So with this, discipline changes, and we start sending people to jail, and we start investigating their lives in order to give them the truth of their sentence, right? So that their sentence is completely aligned with whom we think they are. So in order to assess the guilt or the kind of guilt that an individual might have, we need to know that individual. And this is where he starts developing this notion of power knowledge that I mentioned later in this same slide, because he says, well, those who can produce knowledge are the ones who actually have the power. Because if I'm a psychiatrist, I have the power to determine whether you are a norm or whether you are an abnormal person. And until recently, think about it, the Psychiatric Association thought that people who thought themselves of a different gender than the one that they had been assigned at birth were actually people who were mentally ill. Now they don't think that anymore. Now they think that it's perfectly all right for you to reject your gender and choose a different gender, because you don't really have a gender. There is no gender to you. And we will see this when we study in Core 2, Judith Butler. There is no gender to you. There's really no even sexuality in the sense of something determined, that you're going to be gay or hetero or a lesbian or not interested in sex or a trans person. All of that is socially constructed and is the result of the disciplines, the sciences that have determined what we are in conjunction with the courts that bring in these experts to talk about our truth as individuals. So Foucault thinks that this is a change in governmentality, in the way that governments govern us, based on this different notion of how to handle people's lives in order to produce more life. Because at the end of medieval ages, when capitalism is a powerful uprising force, they realize that they need bodies to produce surplus value that can be extracted by corporations and used by the states to compete with other states in wars or in any other way that states compete against each other. So power, knowledge, very important concepts in Foucault. We empower certain institutions, or how Foucault would call them, apparatuses, where many institutions get together to do something, like sciences, for example. Sciences is an apparatus. The academy is an apparatus. The government is an apparatus. So Foucault thinks that all of this knowledge clearly requires instruments that produce this power knowledge. And one of those instruments that we will study in more detail is the panopticon, this institution within the jail through which you place a guard that can see all of the inmates. And in this way, even if that guard is not there, inmates will always think that there's somebody watching. So for Foucault, we as a society are in a way in this space that is highly controlled, highly surveilled by power. And he does connect power with the bourgeois. In the United States, there was a huge effort, intellectual effort, to decouple Foucault from his analysis of capitalism, from his radical way of understanding capitalism that I contest, along with many other authors, most well known to you, Silvia Federici. So this idea of the panopticon is the idea that we are constantly surveilled by power, and power for Foucault is in the hands of the bourgeois. All this nonsense that you might hear about the power without a face, this is just an effort to defang Foucault, to turn Foucault into a liberal, which he never was. So along with the knowledge of power knowledge, there's also the idea of subjugated knowledges, which are the knowledges that people who are subaltern, people who are not recognized by society as producers of knowledge, people who are not professors, who are not experts in anything, but for example, the knowledge produced by the communities in Chiapas, if nobody gives them voice, those would be subjugated knowledges. They were able to unsubjugate their knowledge when they took over Chiapas, and they became a well-known social movement, and they got their own intellectual who helps them write these things. But otherwise, all the knowledge that people in Chiapas had about neoliberalism, about how to change the world, would have been a knowledge subjugated by power, as we don't get to study in high school, or most often not even in college, the knowledge produced by those subjugated by power, as in the case, for example, of the indigenous people of Chiapas. So I came up with this table, which is not perfect. You will find problems here, but I think it gives you a general idea on how to understand the changes in discourse between Marx and Foucault. And again, I think of Foucault as a different kind of Marxist, a smart kind of Marxist, if you want, while other people present him as a liberal. So Marx talks about class struggle, right? He says that the world has progressed out of the fight between, for example, the bourgeois and the medieval lords. As you know, Marx thought that capitalism was progressive over medieval ages. So he sees class struggle as the motor, the engine of social change, and he thinks it's good, especially when it comes to the proletarian defeating the bourgeois and creating a society where folks can get to decide what to do with their surplus value. Foucault thinks that this struggle is not just over class, he thinks it's a war over everything. Everything in society has meaning, everything that we do, and all these meanings are being contested constantly. The meaning of gender, the meaning of sexuality, class, race, all of it is constantly being discussed in a way that poor people or people who fall out of the mainstream nowadays, for example, somebody who wouldn't be in the mainstream would be a trans person. Well, the meaning of woman, man, that's something over there. There's a war over that quite clearly. There are people who position themselves as saying, women are only those who were born as women, which is kind of nonsense because nobody's born as a woman or a man. We are born. Then they look at our bodies and they say, this one goes more towards male, and male you are. If you're not either male or female, the surgical procedure might come to you and they will determine your truth, and you will become a female or a male whether you like it or not. And later on in your life you might have trouble with this because you might not identify in that way. So Foucault thinks there's a war over everything in society, and that this war is what we are the result, and we are the producers of that war. When Marx talks about ideology, he's talking about this connection between the structure, the base, and the superstructure, the way that we produce our lives and the way that we think about how we produce our lives. As I said before, movies, theater, books, the laws, anything that is not the actual production of our needs, no? So he thinks that there's a connection between the way that we think and the way that we do stuff. Now, Foucault also thinks that, but he thinks it goes beyond ideology. Marx said that it was through ideology that capitalism controlled the proletariat. That the ones who control the economy control the culture, because you decide what books are going to be printed, what movies are going to be filmed, what laws are going to be passed through lobbying, etc. So he thought that there was this huge connection. Foucault thinks it goes beyond the government and beyond the economy. He thinks that the way we are subjected by capitalism is through discourse. It's what we call in social sciences discourse with a capital D. Not the little discourse of me giving a speech, but the discourse, the constant ideas that are generated by all of the powerful elements of society. Non-governmental organizations, governments, different kinds of institutions, especially the sciences, again, psychiatry, medicine. They tell us if we are sick or if we are not sick. Also from the schools, most importantly from the schools, religion, the unions. Almost every institution in society produces discourse. And Foucault thinks that we can have a revolution when there's a pause in discourse. While Marx talked about crisis. A pause in discourse was, for example, 2008, when the economy crashed in the United States, and people started gathering after a few months. They started gathering in plazas, and they start talking about Occupy, and they start talking about the 99% and the 1%. That was a pause in the capitalist discourse of the United States. Up to that point, in the United States, in public discourse, we had never heard that there were social classes in this country. We were all middle class up to 2008. It was through this pause in discourse, the product of a brutal economic crisis, and people starting to discuss in public what was going on, that produces this pause that allows us to start talking about social classes. Marx, on the other hand, talked about the crisis of capitalism, where if things got really, really bad, then you could, you could break the power of ideology, because when the economy tanked, for example, people would see reality. So in a way, 2008 was a crisis. We could analyze it in that way. Clearly, there was an economic crisis and people started thinking about capitalism quite differently for the first time. But there was a lot more than that, right? There was a social movement that had been working since the day of the anti-corporate globalization movement that was coming, re-emerging again, and talking in a very public way to people who felt extremely displeased or at risk because of what had happened with the economy. So Marx talks about political economy to explain that in reality, the economy, when governors tell us there's no money for this, it's all about politics. Because at the same time that we say we don't have money for, I don't know, education of the very young children before the age of 6, we have money to wage war in countries like Michael Moore said, whose names we can't pronounce. So the decisions we make with money are political. The issue is political economy and not just the economy ever. Instead, Foucault looks beyond the economy and the production without giving up on the economy quite clearly, and he studies biopower. In which other ways does capitalism work to subjectify us? What's the role of sexuality under capitalism? What's the role of gender under capitalism? And he doesn't go into it, but very easily we can fit in what's the role of race under capitalism. When Marx talked about dialectics, he thought that he had discovered the mechanism that explains how the world operates. For him, rather than two opposing good and bad, evil and what's the opposite of evil? I can't remember. Whatever the opposite of evil is, all of that is in reality one single entity. And when he thinks about capitalism, he thinks that capitalism has inside of it the germ of its own destruction, which is the proletariat, because everybody works, everybody produces, but the proletariat doesn't get to take the money home. It is the 1%, the bourgeois, who takes the money home. Instead, what Foucault is suggesting that we use as a methodology to understand power is what he called either a genealogy or an archaeology. That we go back, for example, if we think of the concept of race, we go back and find out when did this concept start becoming important and why. What were the conditions in society at that point that explains the emergence of this concept of race. So in our course, we've done that. We've gone back to the 1600s. And we looked at how at that time, when imperialism and colonialism are beginning to be a very important way of for European nations to progress economically, is when we start seeing these ideologies of Eurocentrism. So this is more or less the differences in the concept, so that you sort of understand the jump that we are going to give now when we start looking at Foucault, and we will continue with this line of investigation in Core 2, those of us who sign up for Core 2 with me. So that's an introduction to Foucault, extremely complex thinker, If you didn't understand the text, that's completely normal. It takes a long, long time for anybody to really get into Foucault's ideas. As I said in class, he wrote very difficult books. But if you pick up on his interviews and the classes that had been transcribed, all of this becomes much easier and accessible, but not through the books, not so much. Bueno, so that's it for today.